Okay, welcome to the second PowerPoint on Unit 2 of the WJEC Criminology A-Level, and we're looking at Assessment Component 1.2 today, which is entitled Explain the Social Construction of Crime. So what do we mean by this? Well, social construction refers to the fact that crime, or anything actually, has been made up or constructed by the society. So it doesn't occur naturally, it's something that we as human beings have constructed. So basically, from a criminological point of view, what counts as criminality is simply whatever acts a society deems to be criminal. So what this means is that one society or culture can define a particular act as criminal and pass a law against it, while another culture could see absolutely nothing wrong with that specific act. Likewise, as societies change over time, ideas about what crime is can also change. Now, how does this relate to this course and the exam? Well, for the purposes of this course, you've got to have specific examples of how laws have changed over time, how the laws vary from culture to culture, and have examples that illustrate the key idea that criminality is a social construction. So let's think about some examples in more detail. So I'm going to put some questions up on the board for you to think about. So if you're watching this on YouTube, you can pause at the end of each one, think your own ideas, and then press play and see if you agree with what I've put down or you've thought of other ideas. So let's start with the first question. Can you think of any activities that are illegal in this country but legal in other countries? So have a think if you can think of any examples of illegal activities in this country that aren't legal in other countries. So here are some of the ideas that I came up with. It's not an inexhaustible list. Polygamy, having more than one husband or wife, is illegal in this country. Honour crimes are illegal in this country. Selling cannabis is illegal in this country. Assisted suicide, vagrancy, corporal punishment, which is beating someone with a cane, and female genital mutilation are all illegal in this country, but in some countries are actually legal. Let's look at the second thing to think about. So can you think of activities that are legal in this country but illegal in other countries? So again, if you're watching this on YouTube, pause, think about it, and then press play again. So again, not an inexhaustible list. Here's the ideas that I came up with. Adultery is legal in this country but illegal in others. Homosexuality, jaywalking, prostitution, abortion are all technically legal in this country but illegal in others. Many people think that prostitution is illegal in Britain. Actually, it's not. Prostitution isn't illegal, but living off the earnings of the prostitute or things that are linked to prostitution are. So quite an interesting legal loophole. Third question, can you think of any activities that used to be illegal and are now legal in the UK? So again, you can pause that, have a think. Here are the things I came up, again, not inexhaustible. I've got homosexuality and abortion. And then finally, activities that used to be legal but are now illegal. Again, same thing, not an exhaustible list, but I've got down slavery, corporal punishment, and my final example, nice one here, driving without a seatbelt. When I was a child, you didn't have to wear a seatbelt in a car. No one wore a seatbelt, and there was a big campaign launched by the government to get everybody to wear a seatbelt to keep us all safe, and the slogan went clunk click every trip. Unfortunately, the man who headed that campaign was this man who's, as we know, Jimmy Savile, was perhaps not keeping many people safe at the time. There was a certain irony there. But when I was a child, no one wore a seatbelt, and then the campaign started, and then it became a law. So, what I'm going to do now, I'm going to take you through some examples of how laws have changed from culture to culture. And you can use one or more of these to help you illustrate an exam-style answer. So the first example I'm going to use is polygamy. So how polygamy, whether it's illegal or legal, changes based on the country you're in. So you've got some maps here where polygamy is widely practiced, where in the world it's legal, where it's illegal, etc. But let's go into this into a bit more detail. So first example, comparing different cultures to show that it's a social construct, criminality, we're going to use polygamy. So as I said before in my previous slide, polygamy is the practice of having more than one wife or husband at the same time. Now, technically, polygyny is where a man can take 2 or more wives, and that's legal in around 58 countries, whereas polyandry, where a woman can take 2 or more husbands, is actually confined to only a handful of societies, mainly in the Himalayas. So actually the man can have more than one wife, but in general the woman can't have more than one husband. So some example of sexism there. Where is it legal? Well, it's mainly in Muslim or African countries, in 5 multicultural societies with large Muslim populations. So I'm thinking of countries like India, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore and Sri Lanka. The law permits polygamous marriages, but for Muslims only. And it's a crime in most countries. Even some Muslim countries like Turkey and Tunisia also consider it to be illegal. In our country, if anyone goes through a marriage ceremony when they're still married to someone else, they're committing the crime of bigamy. Again, I'm going to go back to these technical words. If you can learn these technical words, you pick up more examples, more marks in an exam. So use the word bigamy. And the crime of bigamy is punishable in this country up to 7 years imprisonment, a fine, or both. So there you go. So that's polygamy. So let's go down to this a little bit more, okay? So why do we have this variation between cultures? Well, basically it boils down to 2 key factors: religion and tradition. And as we go through some of these examples, you'll see that religion has quite an impact on the social construction of crime. So if we take religion first, in Muslim society, the Quran permits Muslim men to take up to 4 wives, and that's therefore reflected in the laws of most Muslim countries. In the USA, the Mormon Church practiced polygamy until 1890, and it continues to be practiced illegally by some fundamentalist Mormon splinter groups. So here is a Mormon family. If you're in my class, I'll be showing you a video on this. One man, he actually has 6 wives. There's only 5 here. These are his children, and he's a Mormon, practicing Mormon. Now, it's perfectly legal for him under USA law to live with these women and father children by them, but as soon as he starts to marry them officially, then he commits the crime of bigamy. So it's quite interesting how there's a nuance there within the law. Tradition, well, polygamy is practiced traditionally in many African societies, although it would be true to say that it's sharply decreased in recent decades. But you still have examples of people who take more than one wife, such as this man here, who has 4 wives. So that's polygamy. Let's look at our next example, and that is adultery. Now, adultery basically involves a sexual act between 2 people, one of whom or both of whom is married to another person. So where is it illegal? Well, in most countries, where is it legal? In most countries, including the UK, it's not against the law. It's not against the law to have an affair. It may be seen as deviant, it may be frowned upon societally, but it's not a crime. In India, it only became legal in 2018. So prior to 2018, it was illegal. But in most countries, it's not against the law. However, there are some countries where it is criminalised, adultery, mainly in Muslim majority countries, although there are several Christian majority countries in Africa which make adultery a criminal offence, as do the Philippines, Taiwan, and believe it or not, 21 US states. So in 21 of the 50 states of the US, adultery is illegal. It's a criminal offence. And punishments can vary across the world, from stoning to death, which is very rare, to caning in Malaysia and Indonesia. And here you see a woman being publicly flogged for adultery. I think that's in Malaysia. And if you're in America, if you're in the state of Rhode Island and you're caught in adultery, it's a fine. So there are some examples of how, again, a different law culturally influenced. So why is that the case? So again, why does it vary? Well, it goes down to religion again. Let's have a look at, the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Do not commit adultery. So most religions condemn adultery. One of the 10 Commandments, they're shared by Christianity, Islam and Judaism. In societies where lawmaking has been strongly influenced by religion, often you'll find that adultery is a crime. And again, I think you could also link in with why it varies between cultures, is you could look at sexism, the position of women. And laws against adultery are often found in societies where women occupy a subordinate position. They are seen as second-class citizens. And it would also be true to say, in these societies, the adultery laws are also unequal themselves. So it would tend to be that women get punished more severely than men for committing adultery. Here's a quote from the atheist comedian Bill Maher, who says, "Women are also property in our Bible. Adultery is a property crime in the Old Testament, not a sex crime." So this idea that do not commit adultery is not linked to the idea of sex. It's the idea of you have taken the property of somebody else, their wife. So again, it's treating women as an object as opposed to a human being in their own rights. So you can all use those arguments for why the laws on adultery vary between cultures, religion, position of women. And then for my third example, I'm taking homosexuality. So homosexuality, sexual acts between members of the same sex, and they're treated as a crime in a number of countries. And here you've got the map which shows where they're legal, illegal, etc., etc. And you can study that at your own leisure. So where is it legal? Well, homosexuality is legal in the UK, Europe, North and South America, although again it's a crime in many Muslim countries. In Indonesia, the world's largest Muslim state by population, actually it's legal. So where is it a crime? Well, it's illegal in 72 countries and in 45 so are lesbian relationships. What's quite interesting is it tends to be the male act that is seen as more illegal than the female act. In 6 countries, conviction can result in the death penalty, and in some countries such as Russia, it's not illegal, but the law bans its promotion. Many countries which don't criminalise homosexuality do, however, don't allow same-sex couples to marry or adopt. So there is a sort of prejudice against homosexuality. So, why does it vary so much between cultures? Well, once again, down to religion. So many religions, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, have traditionally condemned homosexuality. So countries where religion has a strong influence over lawmaking are more likely to have laws against homosexuality. If you're in a secular society, one where religion has less influence, social norms generally are more tolerant of sexual diversity. And it all comes down to various Old Testament laws, and these are the 2 key verses in the law book of Leviticus in the Old Testament. Leviticus is the 3rd book of the Bible, contains lots of the Jewish laws, which are therefore the Christian laws, and by association Islam as well. And there's this verse here: "You shall not lie with a male as with a woman, it is an abomination." And then the punishment: if a man has sexual relations with a man, both of them have done what is detestable, they are to be put to death. So fundamentalist religious believers will often go using this quote to show that homosexuality is wrong. What's quite interesting is that some scholars actually believe that there is a mistranslation of this word male here, and actually it should be translated: "You shall not lie with a young boy as with a woman. So actually it's condemning child abuse and not homosexuality. And then again, the same thing, this then causes more problems because apparently both should be put to death. So the opinion is divided as to whether young boy is correct or not, but thought I might mention it to you. What is interesting, once again, is that it's only male homosexuality that is condemned. And many people think this is down to the influence of, certainly for Christianity, of Aristotelian thought, the Greek philosopher Aristotle, who defined good as something that served its purpose. So in other words, a good knife would be a knife that cuts well. And this then links to the concept of religion, which is what is the purpose of the male genitals? The purpose of the male genitals are to procreate, to bring children into the world, to fertilize a woman. Therefore, any act that doesn't involve fertilization, in other words, man on man, anal sex or whatever, is therefore not right. It is wrong. It therefore becomes a sin. So that's a religious reason for why some people think homosexuality is wrong. Public opinion varies between cultures as well. So whilst I think in our culture we have become increasingly more tolerant of homosexuality, and I'm going to show you how the law has changed over time very shortly, recent polls in other countries actually show higher levels of support for bans on homosexuality. So some of these countries are where religion has a really strong influence. So for instance, in Egypt, 95% of people in a poll believe homosexuality should be rejected. But actually, Russia, which is a very secular country, increasingly is becoming more anti-homosexual as opposed to more liberal. So Russia is an example of a country that has gone the other way, whereas other countries have become increasingly more liberal and more tolerant of homosexuality. And of course, there's another link here with sexism. And we've got the fact that male homosexuality is a crime in more countries than lesbianism is perhaps due to sexist assumptions by male lawmakers that women are incapable of same-sex attraction, or it's back down to that link of the sexual act itself, not procreating. You can form your own opinion on that, but I've just given you the reasons perhaps underlying why it's legal in some cultures and not in others. So, before I go and look at the way the law has changed in depth on homosexuality, we also need to be clear that sometimes laws are applied differently according to the circumstances in which actions occur. So not only do you have this cultural variation in laws, but you also have the application of the laws being applied differently. So it would be true to say that everyone is subject to the law, and therefore in theory the law should apply equally to all. But there are, and therefore, you know, if it's supposed to apply equally to all, you shouldn't have very many instances when laws are applied differently. But there is a couple of examples. One good one to use is age. And what we mean here is the age of criminal responsibility, when technically you are responsible for your crimes. And opinion is divided on this throughout the world. So if you look at this map here, you can see the age of criminal responsibility ranges from 0 right the way up to 18. So you can see the world is divided culturally, societally, different opinions on this. So in our country, the age of criminal responsibility is 10. So what this means is that any child under 10 years of age can't be arrested, charged or prosecuted for a criminal offence, no matter how much blame can be attributed to them. They cannot technically be prosecuted for a criminal offence. They'll be locked up for the society's safeties, but they can't be prosecuted. In Canada, that age is not 10, it's 12, so 2 years different. In Bangladesh, it's 9, so 1 year younger. So you can start to see how these ideas differ from country to country. And in China, generally 16, just under 16. Okay? So, not only is the age of criminal responsibility, but there are some examples where circumstances might change how the law is applied, and this particularly refers to murder. So there are occasions where, despite murder taking place with the appropriate, remember those technical terms, actus reus, guilty act, and the mens rea, guilty mind, the law does allow the alternative charge of manslaughter to be made. Now, manslaughter only happens in very specific circumstances, and that includes when the offender is said to have suffered diminished responsibility or acted under a loss of control. So there's extenuating circumstances that can be applied. So these circumstances effectively act as a partial defence. So rather than face the mandatory life sentence, so if you're found guilty of murder, you have to serve a life sentence, the law allows you the charge of manslaughter, which it's still an unlawful killing, it's without malice aforethought, and it's in circumstances where it's not murder. So it's an unlawful killing, but it's not classed as murder, and therefore it doesn't necessarily have the mandatory life sentence. What it means is the judge has all the sentencing options open to him or her. So remember those 4 sentences, which are criminal, incarceration, prison sentence, community service, community sentence, a fine or a discharge. All 4 become available. For the murder case, the only sentence can be, if found guilty, life imprisonment. It's mandatory. It has to be given by the judge. So these partial defences are only available to the charge of murder. However, there are other defences that show a person is not guilty of an offence. So these technical terms are consent. So permission was provided by the appropriate person for the crime to occur. You can use consent as an excuse for committing crime. Now, the example I would give perhaps might be assisted suicide, where the person has asked someone to help them die, and so consent has been given. Technically, it would be murder, but you might be able to get a manslaughter plea. Then there's self-defence. That speaks for itself. And then automatism, where the defendant is not in control of their actions. So mentally ill, whatever. Okay. If successful, that would mean a person's not guilty of a crime. So this now takes us on to how laws change over time. And we're going to do a case study and look at the legal history of homosexuality in the UK. Now, just as laws can change from one culture to another, so they can change over time within a society. For the exam, you need to know one in-depth example of how legislation on a particular issue has changed, and we're going to look at homosexuality. Now, what I would also say, year on, year out, there are lots of exam questions where they ask you to give examples of laws. So you'll be learning about, in Unit 1, campaigns for change. You look at Sarah's law, etc. When you are citing laws, refer to them by their legal title. So not Sarah's law, the actual title of the law. So you'll see what the acts are called as I go through this, and I'll point out the one you need to remember. Okay, so you will always get it tends to be on the large mark questions. In order to get maximum marks, you have to have cited the law, given the proper name for the law. So have a few of those up your sleeve as you go through Unit 1, 2, 3 and 4, and just remember those laws. So if we're going to do homosexuality as a case study, it's the final law, which I'll point out as we go through, that you need to memorise. Okay, so let's have a look at homosexuality in the UK, a history of the legislation. And we start in 1533. Prior to 1533, technically homosexuality wasn't illegal. Cases were dealt with by ecclesiastical courts, church courts, but it wasn't against the law of the country. But in 1533, the Buggery Act was introduced, and that made anal sex an offence punishable by hanging. So 1533, that would have been during the reign of Henry VIII. interesting. I'll go back to what I said in earlier slides. It's that idea of the actual penal penetration, the idea that you're not using the penis for what it's intended, may have links to why it's seen as an offence. But it was punishable by hanging. It was repealed 20 years later in 1553, so they got rid of the law. I think that would be when Queen Mary took the throne, and then when Queen Elizabeth comes back in 1563, back comes the law. So from 1533, really, anal sex is punishable in this country by hanging. And that law stayed in place 1835. So 180 odd years ago, these two people, James Pratt, John Smith, were the last two men to be executed for sodomy, for anal sex. And here you see a clipping from the newspaper of the time. So 1835, last two men to be executed in this country for the act of sodomy. In 1861, the Offences Against the Person Act, remember I said, remember the title of these acts. So this act, the Offences Against the Person Act, removed the death penalty for homosexual acts. So it was still illegal up to 1861. 1835 was the last time that anyone was actually executed for it, but actually the death penalty went in 1861. Still meant that homosexuality was illegal, it just meant that the sentence wasn't death, it was instead imprisonment. So a change in 1861, no death penalty anymore. We then moved through to 1885, and they amended the act. Remember that the act prior to that was only sodomy was illegal, anal sex was illegal. They amended the law in 1885 to include any kind of sexual activity between males. So kissing would be seen as, or could be construed as, a sexual act. So whilst they got rid of the death penalty, so you think that they were becoming more lenient, actually, in a sense, it didn't become more lenient, because all acts that were deemed to be sexual in nature between men were seen as illegal, not just the act of anal penetration. And the very famous case of Oscar Wilde was convicted under that law, sentenced to 2 years of penal labour in Reading Jail. Penal means hard labour. And of course, irony is, lesbians were never acknowledged or targeted by legislation. So being a lesbian has never been illegal in this country. So there's old Oscar Wilde, 2 years. And there is the clip for the newspaper for when he was sent down to hard labour for 2 years. And we go all the way through to the 1950s. Nothing changes till the 1950s. And it would be true to say in the 1950s the police were actively enforcing laws that prohibited sexual behaviour between men. Remember, it's still illegal in the 50s. By the end of 1954, there were 1,069 gay men in prison in England and Wales. They had the average age of 37. And there were a number of high-profile arrests and trials, including that of the scientist and mathematician, wartime codebreaker Alan Turing. He was convicted in 1952 of gross indecency, and as part of his sentence he accepted the treatment with female hormones, so he was chemically castrated as an alternative to prison, and he ended up committing suicide 2 years later in 1954. So there's old Alan Turing, the man that broke the Enigma code, probably was responsible for us winning the war quicker than we would have done. And yet in 1952, charged with homosexuality, chemically castrated. There's the newspaper clip about him. So we then move on to 1954, and we have this high-profile trial of Edward Montague, Michael Pitt Rivers and Peter Wildeblood for committing acts of homosexual indecency. It caused uproar, led to the establishment of a committee to examine and report on the law. So these three men were all sentenced to 18 months for homosexuality. Big public outcry, things were starting to change, and they ordered a report to look into how the law could be changed. And this report was the Wolfenden report, key report here. I would learn the word Wolfenden. And it was published in 1957, and it recommended that homosexual behaviour between consenting adults in private should no longer be a criminal offence. So that was its recommendation in 1957. And nothing happened until 1967. Now, I know those of you who have been watching my videos will look at my youthful good looks and think the man can only be mid-20s, mid-30s at the actual most. Well, actually, I was born in 1964. So in my lifetime, homosexuality was illegal. And not until I was 3 was the Sexual Offences Act passed. And basically that act in 1967 said that it's still illegal, you still prohibit anal sex and indecency are still not right, but we are going to do limited decriminalisation of homosexual acts. So we're going to say it's okay if it fulfills the following 3 conditions. First of all, the act's got to be consensual, so both people have got to agree to it. Secondly, it's got to take place in private, and by private that is a private house with no one else in it, so a hotel would not be allowed. And the act had to involve only people that were aged 21 or above. So I would remind you that the age of consent for heterosexuals was 16 at the time. So if you're gay, you could not have sex until you were 21. It had to be in private, couldn't be in a hotel, and couldn't be anyone else present. So there were still elements of it that were illegal. So if 2 18-year-olds had sex, technically homosexual sex, against the law. And that then moves us on to 1994. So I did my A-levels in 82. I started teaching in 87. So whilst I was teaching, the age of consent was still for homosexuals 21. They finally reduced it to 18 in 1994. When that act came through, one amendment was brought in to try and bring the same-sex activity down to 16 to put it in line with heterosexual sex. That was actually defeated in Parliament. So in 1994 it went down from 21 to 18, but there still wasn't parity for homosexuals versus heterosexuals in terms of the age of consent. And there you see a campaign, the picture there, campaigning against it. Then we moved to 1997, and there, because we were in the EU at the time, Boris hadn't taken us out, the European Commission of Human Rights actually found that we were breaking the law and that we as a country were violating and discriminating the age of consent based on people's sexuality. By saying that male homosexual acts had to have a higher consensual age, we were discriminating on grounds of sexuality and we were breaking the law. So we had to do something about it. And we eventually did in 2001. Okay. So 2001, the Sexual Offences Amendment Act came in force throughout the UK. It came in on the 8th of January, and that finally lowered the age of consent to 16. So there you go. I'd already been teaching for 14 years before homosexual people had the same rights as heterosexual people. So also introduced for the first time an act of consent for lesbian sexual acts, as previously there had been no legislation for it. When we get to 2002, finally the law changed so that same-sex couples were allowed to adopt. So prior to 2002, homosexual couples were not allowed to adopt. They were from 2002. And then the big change in 2004 with the Sexual Offences Act. And that's the one you need to remember. The 2004 Sexual Offences Act comes in, sweeps away all the previous laws regarding homosexuality, including that old 1967 Act, and just neutralised everything. It just said there's no difference now. Homosexuality is treated just the same as heterosexuality. All the conditions related to privacy are removed. Sexual acts are regarded the same by law without regard to the sex of the participants. Whatever floats your boat, it doesn't matter. That is the law. It's the same for everyone. So 2004, finally, equality. And in 2005, the Civil Partnership Act came into effect. So we had the first ever civil partnership ceremony took place at 11 o'clock on the 5th of December. There they are. It's quite tragic this, because this couple have been together for a long time. The guy on the right in the wheelchair, he had terminal lung cancer. They had their civil partnership just in time. They were the first to get married, and he died, I think the next day he died. So quite tragic that. But the Civil Partnership Act came into effect in 2005, giving gay couples the right to have a civil partnership. And then not till 2013 did we have the Marriage Same-Sex Couples Act, and that allowed same-sex marriage in England and Wales, and that was passed by the UK in July, came into force in March 2014, and the first same-sex marriages took place on the 29th of March 2014. So when I was 50, finally homosexual couples were allowed to officially marry, had the same total rights as heterosexual people. So we then move to 2017, and the Policing and Crime Act of 2017 actually gave posthumous pardons to thousands of homosexual men from England and Wales who convicted under the region's old sodomy laws, and gave those still living the possibility to have their conviction erased. So basically it wiped clean the slate for everyone else that had previously been convicted. So if you'd been convicted back in the 60s, you were still alive, technically had a criminal record, the 2017 Policing and Crime Act expunged that record. It got rid of it completely. So there you go, there's the headline. So Oscar Wilde, he was dead been dead a long time, but posthumously pardoned. Actually, the Queen had already pardoned Adam Turing. She'd issued a royal pardon, I think, back in 2003, but all people were pardoned. And then finally, 2017, so I'm recording this in 2021, only 4 years ago, the Merchant Shipping Homosexual Conduct Act got rid of the final barrier, which previously, up to 2017, being gay, having a homosexual act on board could lead to dismissal if you were a merchant seaman. And that was disallowed in 2017 April, so only 4 years ago, the final law was got rid of. So there you have it. And how have things changed? Well, in 2019, the DFE, so the Department for Education, published its statutory guidance for teaching relationship education, relationships and sex education. It's the new thing that's coming in at the moment, RSE. It's been delayed a bit by COVID, but it's all part is compulsory in schools now, and everyone's expected to do it. And the guidelines from the Department of Education require us as teachers to acknowledge England's laws concerning LGBT rights. We got to acknowledge the legislation of same-sex marriage, and the protection and the physical well-being and mental well-being of LGBT children. So how things have changed in my lifetime since I was born in 1964 and 2019. And I think if you told me when I was a schoolboy back in 1980 that within 30 years, 40 years we'd have gay marriage, I would have told you it would never happen. Gay rights have really moved on, and rightly so. So why is this the case? Well, I think really it could be true to say that the laws of this country, they've changed drastically over 40 years. Why is that? Well, it's partly due to the fact that homosexuality is no longer seen by many as deviant behaviour. But I think it's not just that. It's also the fact that many high-profile celebrities have come out and are openly gay, and that's contributed to this change in attitude. It's led to this idea that it's not seen as taboo anymore. It's contributed to these changes in attitude. When high-profile people come out and say it's all right to be this way, people think, okay, I'm going to do what they say, and that leads to an increasing acceptance of homosexuality in society. When I was a teenager, this man here, Boy George, with the band Culture Club, openly came out as gay, closely followed by a little later on by Elton John. Ironically, Elton John at one time was married, was in a heterosexual marriage, denying his homosexuality because it wasn't seen as being the right thing to come out. Increasingly, more and more people nowadays come out. This guy here, Gareth Thomas, the ex-rugby Wales rugby skipper, openly gay. No one bats an eyelid. This man here, Nigel Owens, rugby referee, not an issue. This man here, Chris Smith, was the first openly gay cabinet minister in the country back in the 1990s in Tony Blair's government. When I was a child, the leader of the Liberal Party, Jeremy Thorpe, was exposed as homosexual, completely never elected again. So how attitudes have changed. Then you've got Sue Perkins, openly gay, sports presenter, I've forgotten her name, Claire Balding, openly gay, many more, Nicola Adams, etc, etc. These people are role models and are looked up to by many, and that, I think, has also influenced the way that society has changed. And I could have put many more people up as well. So it would also be true to say that high-profile campaigns and pressure groups, such as Gay Pride campaign, Stonewall, have also continued to raise awareness of these issues and apply pressure on the government and on society as a whole. So that links through to what you're doing in Unit 1 with pressure groups, campaigns for change, etc. So, final bit from me on this topic. So I think these changes to legislation demonstrate really clearly how changing societal attitudes to deviance often lead to changes in the law. So when something is not seen to be deviant anymore, things change and laws change. And that in itself is really strong evidence, going back to the original assessment component that we're looking at, of the fact that criminality is a construction of society. It's made up of what society believes. When society's beliefs change, the law changes. I hope you found that informative. Thank you. Goodbye.